Now, what you need to know about Micah is Micah was a prophet of the nation of Israel. Let me give you just a snapshot of history. A long time before Micah, God showed up and made a promise with a guy named Abraham. He said, I'm going to bless you. You're going to be my people. I'm going to be your God. You're going to live different than the rest of this crazy world that doesn't know me. And through that, I want to not just bless you, but I want, by the way that you treat other people, I want to bless the people around you. And that way all the world will know that I'm God and everybody's going to be better off. And so he said, but there's a specific way I want you to live, and it's different than the way that the rest of the world lives. And so they made this covenant. He's I'm going to establish a nation. That nation becomes Israel. And a lot of things go well for a while, don't go well for a while. They start out as slaves in Egypt, but then God delivers them. Yay! And then they build this amazing temple and city in Jerusalem, and Solomon was awesome and David was awesome. But the problem was they kind of created the same system that they left. The only difference was they were slaves in Egypt, but they were the oppressors in Jerusalem. But it was God's like, I kind of care either way because my people are getting hurt, and that's not ever cool. And I kind of don't care what side of the system you're on. Just don't oppress people. And so the covenant was God's like, if you continue to worship me and you continue to live the way I've told you clarity, outlined to live, I'm going to bless you. You're going to live the right way of life. Things are going to go well for you. And actually things will go well for the people around you. But if you don't, things won't go well for you. So they were like, bet, awesome. Got it. Well, that didn't last very long. And they were like, yeah, we found out. And he was like, hey, but just be careful from the foreigners and their gods. Well, it didn't take long before they started chasing foreign women and marrying, and it wasn't about the women, but it was about God knew men are so we're so dumb that we'll just whatever the girl, whatever you think, babe, whatever you think. Well, a bunch of these guys started marrying these foreign women and hey, let me introduce you to my pagan gods who are way different than your God. And whatever you think, babe, for generations. And when you have generations of hey, whatever you think, babe, let's just sacrifice chickens and children and do all the weird, crazy stuff that God said not to do. Let's ignore God and let's do your thing. All of a sudden you have an entire generation, you have an entire group of people that no longer worship God, that no longer follow God, and they aren't really interested in what God has to say, and they've completely broken their covenant. Well, that's the setting of Micah. So what was God's plan, because he's full of mercy, full of grace, was not to strike them down with lightning, but he's like, oh, I know, I'll send messengers, we'll call them prophets, and I'm going to warn them and be like, hey, guys, you've forgotten the command, or the covenant. You've forgotten to love me and don't do that. And they were and you would think that they were oh, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Prophet, for reminding us that we're not worshiping God. We've kind of lost our track. We've gotten off track. We've lost our way. Thank you so much. You would think that was their response, but did they respond that way? No. They were nah, we got to do it how we want to do. It's all good. We like the way this thing turning out for us. And so God keeps sending prophet after prophet to warn them to return to the way that they were living, to return to the way God created them to live. And they actually at one point got so mad they just started killing the prophets. We're tired of this, Well, they didn't have guns then, but it's the same idea. And so that's the context that Micah shows up 700 years before Jesus. And he's one of these prophets. He's like, guys, you're totally ignoring God. You bear his name, and you go to his festivals and you go to his temple, but then you live completely opposite of God. Because here's the crazy part. They wouldn't do anything to God, but they still would go to the temple and they would do their sacrifices. Isn't that crazy? You're never going to believe this, but there were people that would go to a religious building once a week and do religious activities for God. And then the rest of the week, they would live like they didn't even believe in him. Can you believe people used to do that back in the Bible times? I'm so glad we've come so far. This is the setting of the Old Testament. And so Micah shows up, and he's there to warn both Israel and Judah, the kind of two separate lands. He's like, guys, God's been warning you long enough. It's going to not end well. He says, basically, he's like, you're going to end up in captivity and you're going to find your way back in exile. And as history has it, that's exactly what happened. So now you have the Assyrians, they take over Samaria, and that's up the northern kingdom. And then you have the Babylonians, they take over Jerusalem. That's the southern kingdom. This happens between about 586 AD BC to 708 BC. That's not important, but here's what's important. Micah shows up, and in the book of Micah is a short prophetic book towards the end of the Old Testament. And he is reminding them, he's basically saying God doesn't care about you going to the temple. He doesn't care about your sacrifices. He doesn't care about your religious activity because you're not doing the stuff that matters. You're worshiping foreign gods. You have completely broken your covenant. In fact, it's several of the prophets. He's like, I detest your religious activity. Just stop until you start living the way I've called you to live. Because God, from the beginning, was like, I don't really care what you say you believe or your activities. Show me with your life. which is what I love. And so he says, so Micah shows up, and towards the end of Micah's letter, he writes this one scripture, and there's three things that he says. God's like super clear. He's like, I'm going to tell you what you should be focused on. Now, let me remind you of what I require of you if you want to bear my name and be who I made you to be. And it's in Micah chapter 6:8. And he starts out with this. Micah 6:8 says this. He has shown you, oh man, speaking of God, Micah's reminding them, what is good? Somebody say, what's good? Somebody online type, what's good? That's a cool greeting, by the way. If you meet some young hip person, I've just given you a really good, cool hip. Like, don't shake their hand like this. Like, get in there and be like, what's good? And they'll be like, oh, okay, I see you. Like, just for those of you who want to know, these guys know what I'm talking about. Like, hey, what's good? Well, God's like, hey, I know what's good. It's like, imagine you're like, hey, God, what's good? And God's going to be like, hey, thank you for asking. Let me go ahead and tell you what's good. He says, I've actually already shown you what's good. And then he goes on in the second line and he says, and Micah's reminding me, he says, what does the Lord require of you? And here's what's cool. He gives them three things. And these are the three things we're going to talk about over the next 3 weeks. We're going to take one a week and we're going to highlight them. And he says, here's what's good. Here's what I require. Let me make this really simple. I know you have these gatherings. I know you memorize stuff, but let me make this really, 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 really simple. Here's what I require of you. He says, number one, he goes, I want you to do justly. Then I want you to love mercy. And then I want you to walk humbly. He's like, I know there's a bunch of commandments and Deuteronomy's long and Leviticus is crazy and all this and all that and you're hundreds of years. But let me just tell you these three things. Here's what God, hey Christian, hey follower of Jesus, hey man or woman of God, here's what God requires. You want to boil it down? You might make it simple. Let me give you some really simple. Let me give you 6 words. Let me make it real easy. He's like, I think you can remember this. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. He goes, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And if you will do those 3 things, I'm convinced a lot of the other stuff will take shape and you'll find yourself being who I made you to be and you will be back. They didn't listen to him. It didn't go well. The only good news is he did save a remnant. And he says, and Micah at that point started to prophesy. He's like, you're not going to listen to this. Some of you are going to survive, but God is going to bring a righteous king someday and he's going to rule over the whole world. And he was talking about Jesus. And that part happened.